Hey everyone, I'm James Zimmermann, principal clarinetist of the Nashville Symphony, and in today's excerpt education video we're going to look at one of the most feared excerpts in the orchestral repertoire, Maurice Ravel's Daphnis and Chloe. This video will not include any rehearsal footage or concert analysis or any playing at all. Instead, we're going to look at an interview I did with the world-renowned conductor Hans Graf, in which we talked about Maurice Ravel as a composer, Daphnis and Chloe's place in history, and how to conceptualize the opening noodles. Since the excerpts from Daphnis aren't really solos, and pretty much every measure from every clarinet part is fair game for auditions, I think it's better to go big picture here so you can get your head on straight before you embark on your journey with Daphnis. Just a little background on Hans Graf. He was born in 1949 in Austria, and we know him best in the United States as the music director of the Houston Symphony from 2001 to 2013, but he's also held music director posts in Calgary, Bordeaux, and Salzburg. He's also highly regarded as an interpreter of French music, so that's where I started the interview. Are you an impressionist music specialist?
I fear to be called any specialist. I didn't want to be a Mozart specialist after 10 years in Salzburg. I don't want to be a specialist for Russian music, although I studied in Russia and I do very much of Russian music. But it's true that from my 16th year, when I, with a school exchange, came to Paris for 6 weeks, and then it got 8 weeks, I spent every dime I had on buying scores at Place de la Madeleine at Durand, which then still existed, and I still used those scores. I had all the Debussys available, all the Ravels. I came home with such a stack of scores, and they are still in my library. I cherish them. They're the old notes in it, and I remember when I was reading the Ravel G Major Concerto as a 17-year-old, how difficult it was to get it from the score, and how natural later it gets when you live with these scores.
Right off the bat, it's evident how much Hans Graf reveres the music of Maurice Ravel. Imagine that opportunity as a teenager to visit Durand's retail location in Paris, which was literally in the shadows of La Madeleine, and spending all of your money on scores you could barely read, and cherishing them so much that you still have them in your library 50 years later. It's a little different than the IMSLP and YouTube era we live in now, where you can get the sheet music and 10 recordings to pretty much any piece you want for free in 30 seconds. Now those are great tools, but they don't exactly foster the same kind of appreciation for music that people from the old world had. But I digress. The next thing I asked the maestro was about the difficulty of Daphnis. How difficult is the complete Ravel Daphnis and Chloe for the conductor?
It's difficult. It's also difficult to put together for the sheer amount of music. What is making the pain a little bit lighter is the absolute beauty of every bar of the piece. The piece is probably the most complete piece of genius. If you like La Valse, that's fine. That's one situation. Daphnis has it all. Daphnis has everything Ravel could do in his life, from sarcastic to incredibly tender, from majestic to frantic. Well, the Danse Générale at the end is just a tour de force. It goes beyond everything which was written before, including in a way Rite of Spring, because Rite of Spring is such a new continent. But within the range and the possibilities of a big romantic orchestra, which until 1914 was the orchestra of the 19th century, I think that's the Himalaya.
It's clear that Maestro Groff thinks that Daphnis is Ravel's most complete work, hence the comparison to the Himalaya. Groff's comparison of Daphnis to the Rite of Spring is also worth unpacking a little bit. This period from 1909 to 1913 is arguably the greatest period of achievement for ballet in all of history, when Ravel and Stravinsky were getting commissions from Serge Diaghilev at the Ballet Russe in Paris. Let's look at the timeline. So Daphnis was commissioned in 1909, then Firebird premiered in 1910, then Petrushka in 1911, then Daphnis premiered in 1912, and then Rite of Spring in 1913. Imagine being there for all that. Here's a picture of Ravel and Stravinsky from 1910, and here's a picture of Stravinsky and Diaghilev from later. I couldn't find a picture of all three of them together, but You gotta use your imagination a little bit here. Rite of Spring is remembered as a more groundbreaking achievement than Daphnis, but it's not an apples-to-apples comparison. Like Hans Graf said, Rite of Spring is like a new continent, whereas Ravel worked within the bounds of the traditional Romantic orchestra, so their approach was very different. Similarly, Debussy is probably remembered as history's greatest and most innovative impressionist composer, but it's hard to compare Debussy and Ravel because Ravel's style was more classical. Ravel loved Mozart, and he loved melodies, and he loved old forms, so it's hard to look at the differing styles of Ravel and Debussy and say that one is better than the other. All that said, I agree with Hans Graf that within the range of what Ravel was doing and when he was doing it, Daphnis is singular in its greatness. So once we'd established some historical context about the piece, I asked Maestro Groff if he had any technical advice about the noodles.
From Le Lever du Jour, from the sunrise at the beginning of the last suite, you have the spectrum of everything in music.
I have a question as the clarinet player about that sunrise section. You know that we have to play that on every audition.
Yes.
Well, there's a big debate amongst clarinet players when we're practicing those 12 tuplets. Whether we should subdivide in triplets or what do you think about?
It's 2-2-2-2.
You think 2-2-2-2?
A group of three. For me, it has the structure that an active part and a round part.
Interesting. I've never thought of it that way. That could have helped me back on the audition circuit.
It also helps probably to keep the whole section a little bit together if you have a goal in it. Then you can relax sometimes. The whole thing gives them the whole tissue of sound, which is almost like Ligue die Atmosphäre. No, not that's tonal and it's rhythmic, but it's so dense and so many parts of it that it has not to be individual. The whole thing is.
That's fascinating. I'll try that this week.
I will suggest it. I will suggest it tomorrow.
Cool. Wow, so there's a ton of useful information there. Let's break it down. First of all, you should know that some of the best musical advice you'll ever receive will come from non-clarinet players. As clarinet players, we allow the idiosyncrasies of the instrument to influence our interpretations, and we tend to let the clarinet's limitations determine what we think is possible for things like dynamics, color, and tempo, which gives way to some really uninspired playing. Try not to let that happen. Did you notice how Hans sang the noodles? I'll slow it down so you can really hear. That's different than how I sang it. If you sing it Hans's way, it helps give that playfulness that Hans was going for. The active part and the round part. The next day after rehearsal, I was working on this passage with Robbie Walker. He came down from Louisville to play second on this concert, and Hans overheard us and he says, just leave out every other note in the first half like this. Bum 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 bum. And Robbie and I both found it extremely challenging. It's staggering how deeply this passage is ingrained into my fingers, but once I got it, I found it extremely liberating. Liberating from what? From decades of practicing this stupid passage a certain way, so much so that I've experienced physical pain and even at times felt a real hatred for it. But practicing it Hans's way also liberated me from the idea that this passage has to be smooth. For auditions, we think that smooth playing will be more attractive to a committee, but that's not always what the music calls for. There's a certain degree of absurdity to this excerpt because in the grand scheme of things, nobody's going to notice or care if you drop a note or two. Hans even said to Robbie and me that it's okay if we leave a few notes out as long as we have the right character. Sadly, for an audition, you need to make sure that all the notes are there and you get the right character, or at least what the committee thinks is the right character, if they even know the piece you're playing. Playing an audition and performing in an orchestra really are two totally different hats. So there's your tips about the excerpt. Try them out and see if they help. I'd suggest you start by singing the excerpt to yourself and experimenting with those different syllables. My teacher Bert Hara used to tell me that some of the best practicing I'd ever do would be on the bus to and from school, and he's absolutely right. So take out the earbuds, put the phone away, and get to work. Just a couple more things to share here for the real Ravel nerds. Later on in the interview, we got to talking about Maurice Ravel, the man.
He was small.
5'3".
Yeah. And he was very, very aware of his own outfits. Alma Mahler made a joke of him because her husband didn't care how he was dressed. The Ravel came with 50 shirts in his suitcase, so he had everything every day. He was very tidy and very, and in music is the same. Music is the cleanest and the most refined and irreproachable music. It's just as it's perfect.
This is an amusing comparison between Ravel and Mahler as fashionistas. So here's Mahler. You got the classic conductor hair, and then you got the sloppy bow tie kind of tucked into the vest, and yet Mahler's wife Alma is going to take a shot at Ravel for his 50 shirts. Ravel was known for being a dandy. Look at this. You've got the perfect tie dimple and the matching pocket square. Then look at this one. Flawless hair, great skin, so dapper. Then what about this one from when he was younger? He used to rock the beard, but of course, he's got the mustache wax. He's just a smooth character all around. Look at this. Composing at the piano with the cigarette in the mouth and the smoking jacket on. He kind of looks like De Niro from Goodfellas, don't you think? And you can hear this in the music, right? Mahler's music is kind of wild and crazy and all over the place, and Ravel's is put together flawlessly, like a Swiss watch. Hans Graf went on and talked about Ravel's mind.
You know this Asperger? He was very shy with people, probably. But it's also, he wanted his music to be perfect, that nobody can criticize anything which is wrong. And at the other side, I heard that when a thing was done, he didn't want to look back. He was so satiated with it, not satisfied, not only, but filled with it. That's why he didn't proofread later. Daphnis is known for having hundreds of mistakes in the score, which haven't done harm to anybody until now. But it would be nice to get a critical edition. But I think he was very fond of kids, of children. They wrote this beautiful Mamerlois, 5 pieces for the kids for Idan Zipa-Godebski, of the Godebski kids. And probably he was a little bit like a child himself in some aspect in life.
The subject of Ravel's mental illness has been discussed at length. Hans Graf suggested that Ravel might have had Asperger's syndrome, and I think that's fair to say. There's also a great Radiolab podcast entitled Unraveling Bolero, in which Bolero is discussed as a harbinger of Ravel's mental decline. I'll put a link in the description just in case you want to check that out. What's also striking is this idea of finality for Ravel when he completed his pieces. His creative output was relatively low, writing only about 60 pieces, but they're all in the repertoire. You get the feeling that he toiled mercilessly with each one and gave everything he had every time, and when he was done, he was done. As performers, though, we can't really approach our craft that way, especially as orchestral players where the same pieces keep coming back year after year. We have to study our past performances in order to grow. Hans Graf does this too. Listen to this.
And I always go back to my recordings. And I always feel the pain of not having reached what should be reached. And I think that's our condition to life. We always strive and we try to do better. It will never happen, but we never should give up. Sisyphus.
Did you catch that last word?
Sisyphus.
Just in case you don't know who that is, this is Sisyphus. In Greek mythology, he was made to roll a boulder up a hill only to have it roll back down every time he reached the top. So any unachievable task, such as the pursuit of perfection in music, can be described as Sisyphean. I thought it was neat how Hans referred to Greek mythology to describe the struggle of musician life, so I just wanted to make sure that you didn't miss that. So for any of you who are up for the Sisyphean task of mastering Daphnis and Chloe, I hope this video will be helpful to you. Never forget the beauty of the pieces you're studying. The excerpts are so inconsequential in the grand scheme of the works they come from, so don't lose sight of how these works fit into the composer's lexicon and the musical landscape of the times. If you're a Ravel enthusiast like me and you want to learn more, I highly recommend R.B. Orenstein's book entitled Ravel, Man and Musician. It's terrific, it's well organized, and I refer to it whenever we play Ravel's music in the orchestra. Hans Graf is a fan of this book as well. So good luck, happy practicing, and I'll see you next time.